Welcome to Flow Unleashed. I'm Cameron Norsworthy, and this is your podcast for human performance.
Okay, welcome back, and I imagine they're very different flavors of self-sabotage as well. So what are 3 or 4 most common patterns you see, and how does each one of those relate to blocking flow?
There's lots of patterns, some of which are laid out in the book. The main few that come to mind just immediately is this, first of all, our relationship with failure. For a lot of people, failure is bad. And straight away, with that belief statement or narrative or story, what's the consequence of that? The consequence is expectation. The consequence is fear. I mustn't fail. I mustn't mess up. I mustn't look bad. Tightness, compensation, over control. We're straight back into the red. And a lot of people haven't really, unless you're in charge of a culture or a team that is facing success or failure, don't really think too deeply about what is my relationship with failure. Do I see failure as true feedback? Or do I see failure as some consequence? Or do I see it as representative of who I am as a person? And so if we can just explore our relationship with failure, that can stop us from self-sabotaging our future efforts. Another one, coming back to what we were talking about before, is, again, our relationship, but this time with fear. We talked about allowing intimacy, and the emotional journey towards, let's say, a performance setting is the same. And by the way, I keep using performance or saying performance. And when I talk about performance, I don't necessarily mean the athlete or the artist on the stage. I mean the body performing an act. If we're cooking, the body is performing an act. If we're having a conversation, the body is performing an act. If I'm writing an email, the body is performing an act. And to come away from that sidebar, when we have a look at our relationship with fear, often there's a huge friction to fear. I don't want fear. I don't like it. It doesn't sit well in my body. And as a result, there's friction, and we're back in the red. And if we can learn to be intimate with fear, if we can learn to invite fear, be comfortable with fear residing in our minds and body, then the friction's taken away from it, the anxiety's taken away from it. And we can start to use a lot of that as helpful stress as opposed to flipping us into distress. So often people self-sabotage themselves by the relationship they have with fear, and they enter situations, become fearful, and then respond in a manner that isn't aligned with flow and puts them into the red. And then a third obvious self-sabotaging scenario is people not owning the contents of their consciousness. We might this is going a little bit onto the sequence of steady, the next part of the book. But we might do all the wiring of our brain and the philosophical approach, etc. We might have that down pat and be fully invested in it. But if we don't continue to own our consciousness, if we don't continue to create interactions, thoughts, feelings, environments that are aligned with it, we're going to get distracted. We're going to get conflicted. And if we're not managing our mind, if we're not managing our consciousness, if we're not managing our emotions, then we'll get flipped into the red at some stage or another.
What does it mean to own your consciousness?
To take accountability for it. Right now I'm having a conversation with you, And my subjective experience is one of interest, freedom, excitement. I feel slightly empowered, because I'm talking more and you're coming to ask me questions, so I'm naturally positioned in that space. There's a whole experience to what I'm feeling right now. And in certain scenarios, we might not be in control of that. Right? If I walk into the office at work one morning and I just walk in and suddenly I go to my desk, there's 150 emails, there's 3 messages, there's Johnny over there, he's wanting to ask a question. I'm reminded of something that I didn't do yesterday. Suddenly my internal experience has become overwhelmed. Stress is upon me because I haven't come in and owned my consciousness and gone, okay, I'm excited to take on these challenges today. I've chosen to be here. I want to be here. Bring it on. What's happening? And straight away, by owning that volitional stance, by owning those thoughts, by owning the feelings that are coming up in my consciousness, that changes how I perceive all those external triggers I suggested earlier. And often it feels a bit, I guess, if we're not used to it, like hard work to manage our consciousness or I often, instead of talking about consciousness, I talk about the inner game, and whether we're proactive in our inner game or not. And I guess it can be a little bit easier or more digestible, that terminology. But if we're constantly being proactive with that, then the world works for us and flow, we're less likely to self-sabotage us. But if we're not, we're at the whim of any distraction or any conflict, both externally or internally. And that ultimately leads us to self-sabotaging our own flow.
Yeah.
And I guess a last one I just want to touch on, I won't touch on too much because this goes into that last stage of the book, flow. But, we often self-sabotage ourselves by being afraid of our own self-actualization. We're not used, and I'm obviously talking in very generalistic terms here, we're not used to being in our light. As a famous quote from Marianne Williamson said once, we're more afraid of our light than we are of our dark. Living in self-limiting beliefs, living in our own self-constraints is more comfortable. We don't have to risk as much. We don't have to believe in ourselves as much. It's normal. It's very normal in society. And so it's easier. And so we become used to that and we end up becoming afraid of our light. And so with a lot of people, there's a lot of self-sabotaging that goes on just because we either don't believe we're worthy of it or we're just not used to it. And so that's a really interesting latter part of the book.
A lot of this seems tied to the stories that we tell ourselves. What's the most insidious stories you hear from your clients, from high performance for?
The standout is there's got to be that the high achiever need to be perfect, perfectionism, beat myself up when things aren't going well. I'm going to shout myself into, give myself the stick in order to be better, perform better, and end up burnt out. End up achieving, but not enjoying that experience, stressed out, just wanting an escape of it all, wondering when it's all going to be over, with a whole host of success tax. We've done something okay or well, but there's a whole load of tax to what that's happened. And with a lot of people, it's broken families, it's all the stuff in the background. It's people, low motivation and loss of friendships, loss of deep connections, our identity being purely tied to that singular activity. And then when it's not going well, our whole persona becomes depressed, and the roller coaster of that emotional and experiential experience behind it all.
Mm. Does the need for control show up as a major interference pattern here?
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of perfectionism is built on that lack of self-worth, lack of self-esteem. Things need to be better, and in order for them to be better, I need to be in control of everything for them to be better. And then if I'm out of control, then things aren't good. I'm not good. Yeah, and so much of that, the need to control, is that thinking brain's game of captaining our cognition. Is that explicit system that we talked about in the first couple of episodes of this series. This idea of, we have two brains in our brain, dual cognition, if you like, and often when things get challenging, uncertain, as when things are not in control, or they might be in control, but we feel they're not within our control, the thinking brain steps in and unintentionally creates more threat responses, more uncertainty with the thoughts that we have. And at some stage, people get to a place where they've run that script so many times, they're ready for something new. For some people, I've been doing it for 30 years. I'm number 10 in the world. I know I should be number 1, but I just can't bridge that gap. For other people, they're 16 years old. They've realized they've walked up to someone they fancy, and they realize that they just can't have the same fluency that they do with a friend, and that approach doesn't work, and they're ready and willing to change there and then. And there's every scenario in between. Everyone's got their own threshold. We're willing to let go of that approach, that narrative, that red, and adopt the blue, and work with ourselves, work with our brain and body, as opposed to despite it, and move from coping into an optimal strategy. And at some stage, we have to focus the efforts on building new habits as opposed to sponsoring those old habits. But to do that, there takes that leap of faith that I'm willing to surrender control, or I'm willing to not worry about losing control in order to try something new. And for a lot of people, we don't reach that place until we've exhausted the previous option. And for some people, that's total burnout, and it's the lowest point of their life. And for other people, they're willing to adapt a lot earlier. It just depends on the individual.
Yeah, it really depends on your history and your makeup and the time of your life when you do it and when you get to that, and if.
But we don't have to wait for that, I guess. It's important people listening to it. Like, we don't need to follow that script to the end until we're absolutely fed up of it. We can make choices. It's easier to choose to have faith in that new way of performing, that new way of approaching a challenge, which the blue flow mindset offers. When you try it out and you realize its effectiveness, you realize how good it feels, you realize my experience is different, and it's one that I want and one I prefer. And in building many success stories and in building experiential gains, we start to trust it more and we start to desire it more, and then that takes over. So really important I might have painted a picture that we can only jump into the blue once we've reached a level of fatigue with the red, but it's certainly within our control to create those new habits.
Yeah, and as we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, right, even for someone that's not always in the blue, in the red, that still might happen that you're slipping into it. And you can come back from that. Hey,
Hmm. Yeah,
think about,
absolutely.
yeah, think about someone reading this book who's been chasing flow for years, but just can't seem to find it consistently. What would really reveal to them about why they might have been struggling?
This stage of the book is, as you probably guessed from our conversation, it's the deeper side of the book, right? It's the book that deals with our self-relationship. It's how we're leading ourselves. And so I think even people who have read this book who are far down the rabbit hole of self-development, even when I read it again, I still reflect on it and I'm still learning stuff about myself, even going over my own stories. So there's always that reflection of, okay, this is how I was responding to myself at that given moment. And so I think anyone reading it, whether you're, been chasing flow for years and just coming across it, or whether this is the first self-development book you've ever read, there's this idea that we need to look at how we relate to ourselves in order to progress. In order to be more optimal, we need to be agile and approach how we do things in a more optimal manner, which is very clearly laid out in the book. So, yeah, people will unpack their story, their inner narratives a bit more, how they see themselves in the world, how they see themselves in relationship to success and failure, and certainly how they approach pressure and how they orientate themselves to challenges.
Mm-hmm. A lot of readers and listeners and people you're watching, they might have tried mindfulness, goal setting, visualizations, all of these different things that are popping up and going out or here to stay. But why does the Ready framework work differently? What's different about this?
It works with all those things. All those things you mentioned, what are we doing? Mindfulness, we're managing our thoughts. Goal setting, we're directing our thoughts. Visualization, we're, again, directing our thoughts or feelings, or depending how we do the visualization. So those are all psychological skills, rather than this ready section of the book is an approach. It's a mindset. It's can I put flow into all of those things you mentioned and others? It focuses on not what we do, but how we do what we do, which is really, really, really integral. And it also sets flow as that seed intention, which is often very, very different from how we're taught to be mindful, how we're taught to do goal setting, how we're taught to visualize. So it certainly is refreshing from that point of view. And, my experience, and one I hope to lay out in the book, is when we do put flow as that seed intention, it does drastically change how we do these things. It changes our focus of goal setting. It changes our experience that we're questing during our goal setting. It changes our experience of the setting, and it probably changes the goal. So it's quite fundamental to how we go about and do these psychological skills. And it's really important that flow comes first because it has that impact, as opposed to tagging flow on at the end.
Mm. Okay, so how long does it typically take someone to master Ready? Are we taking days, weeks, months?
Good question. It's the same question I get from every new client that
I can imagine, yeah.
How many sessions do we need, and how long is this going to take? And
How much
I
time until I'm optimal?
yeah, and I get it. I sometimes ask myself the same question. Um, my experience of working with others is that there's breakthroughs that happen in the short term, for sure. And when things are comfortable, when things are, just taking a sporting analogy, right? If we take this flow mindset, we might read the book and be like, wow, okay, that's interesting. Let me try it. Let me experiment with it. And we go out into the sporting world and we're in training where there's no real risk, there's no real pressure. And we apply it and we're like, great, this has deepened my satisfaction. I felt looser. I felt like I could play with more freedom. I was trusting myself more. This is great. Breakthrough. It works. But then we go into a competitive situation and a cut game, and the stakes are higher and the pressure's on, and we haven't built enough trust with that approach. So we default to our old conditioning and then come out of that game and we're like, oh, I was so tight and it just felt awkward. And where was that experiential freedom I had previously? And, has all that work I've just done just gone out the window? Was it all worth it? And it can feel really frustrating. And so my general feeling is that our psyche evolves like unpeeling layers of the onion.
Mm.
And if we keep applying the lessons in this book, we'll have breakthroughs and satisfaction will improve and performance will improve as byproducts of improving the quality of our experience as we go along. And in environments where there isn't as much risk, fear, intimacy, we're going to get quicker wins, and those more challenging contexts take time. And for each person that's different, depending on how much conflict or distraction there is in those deeper layers of pressure and deeper layers of complexity, deeper layers of intimacy. So, yeah, and that's quite individual. For some people, for younger people, it's obviously takes a little bit quicker, but it's also with young people, there's less conditioning to thought, but equally, people who are slightly older, they might be more ready and more willing to sort of let go and create new habits. So it is quite individualistic.
Why is self-leadership so foundational? What's happening in the brain and nervous system here?
Using the analogy of a flashlight, we're in the dark, and you can play along as I talk about this if you want. If you imagine yourself in a dark room, you've just woken up and there's darkness all around. If you close your eyes, it's even more powerful. And what's the first thing you do? You start to put your hands out in front of you and look for stability. You look for some kind of security, some kind of door or floor to lean yourself up against. And that experience is essentially like our consciousness. There's this whole world out there, and we're always looking for some kind of thread, narrative, security to feel more in control and fill our consciousness with things that we know, that we can categorize, that we can reaffirm. Hence why we look into the world and look at things that reinforce the way we believe, because it makes us feel more in control, more powerful. And our self-leadership's like that flashlight in that big dark world that allows us to look at things. So it changes how we perceive things, it changes what we see, then how we interpret them, how we respond, and it underpins everything we do. And we only need to have a look at waking up ill and our experience of trying to make breakfast or take the kids to school or show up at work or have a conversation when we're feeling ill. Our self-leadership when we're ill is not going to be optimal because we've got this physiological friction dragging us down. So it changes everything that we do. Yeah, and we can see that from a neurobiological level, and neuroscience is just starting to help us understand how the brain works during those different conditions. And if we're inviting challenge and pressure and intensity, our physiology works very differently than if we're creating friction with it. Our sympathetic nervous system, our left amygdala, the cortisol in our body, there's going to be a lack of synchronicity in our brain regions and so forth. But when our self-leadership is aligned and not creating friction and conflict, then there's so much more internal harmony and sort of a homeostasis, if you like, within our neurophysiology that can occur.
Your PhD work has been advancing flow science itself. You've literally shaped how we measure and understand flow. How did living in both worlds, both in the lab and the coaching room, inform your decisions to write this book?
As I explain in this part of the book, they've gone hand in hand. In my practice, I've always been keen on using evidence-based practices, and practically I've always taken the research and tried to explore how that works in different settings with different people and understand the sort of the practicalities of it. And equally, what's happening at the cutting edge in practice is often years ahead of where the research is. For good reason. It takes a lot of time to be able to ensure something is robust and generalizable and not just, I guess, a subjective N of one scenario that doesn't work for something else. So they fed into each other, and I've used one to question the other and taken theory-led practices and put them into practice and seen how the individual has responded, and then worked with the individual and how they like to do things, and then tried to look at that in new feasibility studies or understand if there's some kind of generalizability around what's happening there, as I've done with flow training and so forth. And hopefully in the future that will continue, because both science needs to create more meaningful, practical work that could be used in the real world, and also coaching techniques and coaches need to use more sort of robust techniques that have integrity that we know can be really, really impactful and effective for people. We also never know what we're creating at the time. And I always remember this young cricketer that I coached, and we worked on an active goal achievement theory and moving from an ego-orientated approach to a real inviting the challenge approach. And slowly, he kind of got it, and then we had to work a bit more practically, and we ended up with this phrase, challenge me. And for him, it was like, I'm in the crease, the bowler's coming at me. And then research wasn't, I guess, at this stage, at that point, but we then figured out through practically using it that he not only had to say, challenge me and be looking at what can I learn here, but he also needed to want the bowler to bowl the best possible bowl that he could bowl. Because in inviting the bowler to be their best, he knew that it would bring out his best. And if it was anything short of that, there would be a level of protectionism. There'd be a level of fear or level of, or maybe he might get me out, or maybe I just need to play safe type scenario. And so that was really interesting to me, that it needed to go to another depth. And so we worked on that, and it helped him a lot, and he was able to improve his cricket. And then he turned up one day. This story is a bit more in detail in the book. He turned up one day and he was like, "Oh, guess what?" And I was like, "What?" And expecting he's just hit 50 runs or something, in an important match. And he was like, "I've just came out of my exams and I loved it." I was like, "What?" He said, "Yeah, it was such a cool experience. It was like the clock was counting down and I was like really into it, and everyone else around me seemed quite nervous, and I just seemed to like really enjoy the questions. And he sort of, he was beaming because he had applied that learning from one context to another. It had been a sort of a dispositional, if you like, impact for him about how he was approaching challenges in general, how he was approaching pressure in general. And so it's really helpful, I think, to integrate those practices, because we never know what we are impacting as well. And if there's integrity or robustness to the evidence-based practices that we're using, at some level that's going to have a deeper effect for the individual.
Yeah. I'm sure listeners might enjoy to hear that story from you as well. So that's cool. Now, if they haven't read it, they can go and explore more. And if they read it, they can hear it from you. So that's cool. As an entrepreneur, you've faced the moments that every founder does face. When your doubt creeps in, when the cash flow tightens, you start to question everything. How do you use a flow mindset to navigate these moments?
I mean, nowadays, I don't want to leave home without it. Because anyone that's run a small business knows the uncertainty, knows the roller coaster ride, and it can just be painful and fatiguing and exhausting and a horrible experience, quite frankly, when there's so much out of your control and there's so much energy you're putting into a direction, and there's so much uncertainty of what might come back, what sales are going to come in from the marketing expenditure and efforts and all the rest of it. And there's always, with young businesses, a certain leap of faith that needs to be taken by the entrepreneur, and you can mitigate that with plans and so forth. And different businesses will have different risk profiles based on the history and the planning and the proof of concept that's been before, etc. But there's ultimately that internal journey where if we focus on the process, we become more effective, we become more engaged with the task that we're doing, and we become less distracted by our fear. The flow mindset for me just allows me to have faith in what I'm doing. It allows me to really sit back from that frenetic reaction to all those distractions and sit with my intuition. What am I creating here? If I put energy and effort over here, what's the snowball effect of that? What's the consequence of that? And it actually allows me to enjoy that uncertainty. It actually allows me to go, well, that's part of the process, and that's kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing as well. And it makes it more interesting. And so it allows me to embrace that uncertainty and pressure rather than fight it. Being an entrepreneur, there's a certain level of pivoting and application that you need to put in, and effort that needs to be put in. But that's not helpful when we're in the red, when we're reacting off stress-based patterns of behavior and thinking. And the flow mindset brings back into the blue zone, being calm, being composed, creating meaning and value instead of just ticking boxes. And in one of my first businesses when I was a lot younger, I got distracted by, it was a travel company, and we weren't selling holidays at the high end that we wanted to. And we kept pivoting and selling cheaper and cheaper and cheaper holidays in order to get more sales, to have more security and control over the business. And suddenly a few years later, we're competing at the bottom end market. It's a race to the bottom, who can sell the cheapest holiday. And all the quality and all the value that we wanted to offer in the holiday, which is the whole reason of doing it, couldn't happen because it just wasn't affordable. So we're suddenly in a completely different business, doing something completely different than I ever wanted to, all because reacting out of stress and reacting out of fear, and so that's a sort of, I guess, a good example. And then I had to reset and pivot and recreate what we were doing in order to realign and actually find meaning in what we were doing. And the individual journey of an entrepreneur, because I'm one myself and I coach many of them, can be an absolute roller coaster that just creates burnout and uncertainty for the family and the individual involved. And ultimately, it's an incredible journey of great privilege. Not many people are in a privileged position to do so. And it can be one of the most enjoyable, enriching experiences if it's done in a manner that's aligned and embracing that pressure and friction. So certainly when running a business, whilst I might get triggered, like every human, into the red, I always endeavor to put that flow mindset on, because it just allows me to enjoy the journey rather than endure the hair-raising roller coaster ride that it otherwise can be.
Yeah. Cam, thank you for laying out ready for us. I'm looking forward to going deeper into the other two.
My pleasure.
And thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to get notified when our next episode drops. The more people that subscribe, the better I can make the show for you. Equally, please leave a review. Your review will go a long way to helping others find this pod. Until the next time, thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed.